Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's a real shoot 'em up round when I put Clint Eastwood's The Gauntlet against Charles Russell's Eraser. And man, this one was a hard decision too, because both of these movies are kind of fun in their own right. So let's just get on down to it. First up, we have Clint Eastwood's The Gauntlet, starring Clint Eastwood, of course, and Sandra Locke, who was the on and off co-star of Clint Eastwood's all throughout the 70s and well into the 80s. And this film, we find Clint Eastwood playing a character not too dissimilar from what he's played before. You know, it's somewhere in between, kind of like if Coogan's Bluff was a Dirty Harry film. You know, we see him immediately. He's like an alcoholic. You know, he walks out of the car and the bottle of booze falls on the ground and stuff, and he walks in all slumped. Now, the thing about Clint Eastwood is he is kind of believable as a drunk, because his whole glare like that shit, you know, kind of makes you think that he's coming off of a drunk, you know, most of the time. Just kind of angry and confused all at the same time. But anywho, so he ends up getting this job of hauling this witness from Vegas to Phoenix, where he's located. And so he goes to Vegas thinking it's going to be simple enough, even thinking it's a dude. It turns out to be a chick played by Sandra Locke. And, you know, from then on, you know, she's convinced that she's not getting out of this thing alive, because she's a prostitute and she fingered somebody. She doesn't let on that she knows it's the mob, but when it's revealed it's the mob, it kind of makes sense, where everything's all kind of batshit crazy. The mob is infiltrated the police force. So anytime Clint Eastwood tries to call in some help, it turns into a massive shoot. And there's a lot of shooting in this film. You know, they fucking obliterate a house with gunfire. They obliterate a bus with gunfire. You know, the film itself is not very inventive in ways of action, but it does have a lot of like spectacular stunts, very breathtaking stunts all throughout the film. But it kind of just is like the recycled shit over and over. There's not really much to it. It is pretty gritty. It's definitely kind of a film that you feel like Peckinpah might have passed on. And Clint Eastwood does his best to do a Peckinpah type film. Even has Jerry Fielding doing the music for this. And the music is incredible, of course. Usually when Jerry Fielding did the score, it was nothing short of brilliant. But, you know, the film, you know, most of the way through it does kind of hold your attention. You know, it is very well paced. You know, there's a lot of funny moments too. You know, the chemistry between Clint Eastwood and Sandra Locke were good, because they were both on like kind of the same level of acting. You know, they weren't, neither one was gonna outshine the other. I mean, I guess Clint Eastwood to a certain extent, but as far as like, you know, emoting anything, you know, they seem to be kind of perfect for each other. But that's the one thing that kind of kills the Gauntlet a little bit is, you know, whereas the action is very realistic and, you know, kind of puts you right in the middle of it. The romance that brews between Clint Eastwood and Sandra Locke in the film is kind of bullshit, you know. Because the thing about it is, there is a point in the film when they kind of take the cop hostage, played by Bill McKinney, who's absolutely brilliant in the film. There is this kind of mutual respect acknowledgement that they have, but not anything that I would think would constitute, you know, brewing up a romance and stuff. But, you know, it's getting to the big studio movie, you know, everybody's got to have like a romance or some shit. But all that shit just feels tacked on, especially the end. And, you know, in a film where it's been nothing but like just shoot 'em up crazy, you know, the whole solution to anything is to just blow hell out of whether it's a house or a bus. But when they get out of that fucking bus, they don't get shot. That's fucking dumb, you know. And the fact that the cops just part like the fucking Red Sea, I guess it's some kind of signal of respect or something. But I don't know, it just feels so contrived. And then even the final showdown with the, you know, the typical uptight white dude that's corrupt that ends up shooting Clint Eastwood, but then Clint Eastwood ends up killing him. And, you know, it's just all kind of basic in the end, whereas like, you know, it's not a shitty movie, but it's far from a great one. And then we move on to Charles Russell's Eraser, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger in a similar part, only like his whole job is with the witness protection agency. You know, the film, a brilliant opening of a film where we see Arnold doing his thing that he normally does. He's saving this witness from getting his tongue cut out by a bunch of gangsters and stuff. And, you know, the whole thing, from the title of the thing, is getting erased and stuff. He basically, when people think that they're doing a hit, he ends up doing a hit on them, and then they fully disappear. But it only happens once, and everything in the film ends up being used to an advantage. But what the call to action is basically, Vanessa Williams is working with the FBI. She works for this really fucked up corporation that's dealing in illegal arms smuggling and all this shit. And they're basically coming after her after the one dude that was right above her ends up killing himself when he finds out she's been being a rat for the FBI. So now it's Arnold's job to make sure she's safe and stuff. And the thing about it is, and another point where the Gauntlet kind of fails, is Vanessa Williams is really badass in this film. She can kind of hold her own against Schwarzenegger, whereas like Sandra Locke couldn't really hold her own with Clint Eastwood. They decided that there's no romance either in Eraserhead. And then the villains are a lot more sinister, because most of the villains in the Gauntlet were like, kind of faceless, nameless people just shooting, thousands of rounds of bullets. Whereas like James Caan, which plays like, basically Arnold's boss in the film, or maybe he works on whatever the fuck, he's somebody higher standing than Arnold, and he's the one that's corrupt, and he plays it brilliantly. He chews the scenery like a pro. James Caan, of course, one of the greatest actors of all time, and another very underrated actor, James Coburn, pops in there. He doesn't do much in the film. He's kind of the guy that knows all the shit, but he's not, fully revealing anything, and he's letting it all play out. And the action really is, even more breathtaking than the Gauntlet, because there are moments specifically with the alligator sequences that are just kind of, you can tell with very bad use of CGI, which, granted in the mid 90s was still, being tweaked and all that shit. But, there was some like certain scenes where there's explosions and you've got Arnold and whoever he's protecting running away from him. You can tell that it's kind of fake, kind of tacked on, but the movie itself overcomes it, because even with the alligator scene, when he shoots that alligator, it's like, your luggage. Yeah, I'm not even going to attempt to do it, but, it's a very, and that's the thing, too, is that even at this point in time, this was kind of the downswing for Arnold as far as an action star, because, after the incredible run that he had all through the 80s and even in the early 90s, this is when the film started getting ridiculous. But this was kind of the last vestige of like great action films that Schwarzenegger did in the 90s. And like I said, of course, Vanessa Williams is very badass in it too, and like everything that's used, because even that witness that we see him help in the beginning, he comes back and helps him with some stuff, gets with some gangsters, and they fucking shoot up a bunch of arms dealers and stuff. That ending shootout, that it all kind of comes together, and all that fake out, like I said, because even all the other people that I don't know their fucking names and shit, side characters, like everybody's just absolutely brilliant in this movie. They play the parts they need to do. Eraser kind of knows what it is, and it doesn't fuck around. It doesn't waste time with like romance and all that shit. So this round clearly has to go to Eraser, because like the thing about it is if you want to do like a badass movie like this, at least have it where like, the man and woman are even, we don't have to have those discrepancies and shit. And there's no point in like, oh, they end up really hating each other at the beginning and they both want to fuck her. They both want to fuck each other, so it just gets kind of lame. So for anybody keeping score, that's 50-45. 70s are only up by 5. The 90s win this round. They're tightening that lead, because, stuff like Eraser can surprise you, like where it seems like mindless action. It does have, more depth than something like the Gauntlet, which, it tries to be, just balls to the wall action, but can only really repeat the same 5 sequences through a nearly 2-hour movie. Whereas like Eraser, they keep upping the ante. And yeah, some of the weapons are a little out there, but that's kind of explained in the film, because it's a bunch of illegal arms and stuff. So, and I mean, Arnold's always badass. I would argue that Arnold's way more badass than Clint Eastwood in some regards. They're both equally iconic, but, and also in the sense that like Arnold in Eraser, is just really that good at his job. Whereas like the Clint Eastwood's character in the Gauntlet is, very like, is doing it more out of spite than just being good at his job and stuff, you know. And I would argue though that Clint Eastwood did some of his best directing in the 70s, and the Gauntlet is a clear-cut example of it. It knows what it needs to be. He's really good at the pacing, but I feel like there were either shit that got added into the script or just to make it more palatable to a mass audience. Whereas Eraserhead just balls to the wall action, doesn't get bogged down in a romance, and just fucking does its thing. You know, it definitely leaves you thoroughly entertained, and you know the good guys win and all that shit. Is perfect action movie. So 50 to 45, 70s are up by 5 still, but the 90s keep coming back with all these fucking surprises and shit. And if I've said anything wrong, anything you disagree with, feel free to eviscerate me in the comments. This is all up for debate. I'm just on a rough draft to my doctoral thesis of which decade was better for filmmaking, the 70s or the 90s. You know, I'm just having fun with this shit, and I hope you are too.